Hello, hello. I am Sinner, and I am back with another episode of Leviathan Times. This is a series where I just go over Substack articles that I've written and talk about them in video form in a more free flow way. Um, yeah, this is chapter 4, Democracy Killed Liberty. Now, more or less, this argument basically comes from uh, um, Liberty or Equality, which was a book written by Eric von Kunhout-Leden, and I'm more or less taking certain arguments I read in that and repackaging it. So what am I talking about with democracy killed liberty? Basically, the main premise is that um, democratic states justify themselves by representing a particular people, but in order for that representation to be genuine, everyone has to be, they can be aesthetically different, but they can't be substantially different. Any multicultural, like truly multicultural system would not work in a democracy. And to bring this up, I talk about the French Revolution. So before the French Revolution, only 20% of the French population actually spoke French, like metropolitan French. Most people used local dialects like Norman, Basque, Catalan, Occitan, Breton. You get the point. Flemish, right? And culture and tradition was based on local uh, things. So the culture and tradition of someone living in, the south of France in his little town where everyone speaks Occitan is very different from someone living in Brittany. And it's all based around the local customs and diversity. And it's the same thing in the Holy Roman Empire. The Holy Roman Empire had Czechs, Italians, Dutch, Slavs of all sorts, like Sorbians and all this sort of stuff. And the other thing is that there wasn't just like local autonomy in the sense that people had different diverse languages and customs, but also in the fact that people literally had local autonomy. So a lot of the courts were local, the guilds were local, the church was, well, the church, um, so that was in Latin, but even still, it represented the local parish. And it meant that, for example, if you committed a crime, typically it would be the people in your town who would persecute you of whatever particular crime it was. It wouldn't be the state or the federal government. It would be like your local judiciary that did it. So this linguistic diversity, this dialectical diversity, and the cultural diversity is sort of a something that went away with like modern democratic revolutions, and in the name of standardization and efficiency um, and nationalism, uh, the the differences in dialect and culture were basically flattened to make one uniform national position. And it's typically in the name of, efficiency or whatever it is. But and this comes from the democratic will, right? Because if you're trying to say I represent the French people, but the French people only make up 20% of your government's region, like the territory that they control, then that's kind of silly, right? So you have to enforce a national identity or enforce an identity onto the masses in order for you to be able to represent them. So the sort of raison d'etre, you have to make the raison d'etre to justify your own representation of them, which means that you sort of have to colonize your own nation in a way. And this was something that went away with the revolutions, and local autonomy and local authority and real local political authority went away, which is quite a shame in my opinion. I think that, you know, um, national education, language laws, cultural centralization, they don't really they're not really that good. And it takes away freedom to represent yourself as a distinct person or your community as something distinct. And a lot of people might argue that, well, this is sort of silly because we live in a multicultural society. So doesn't that like disprove your point? Don't we live in a multicultural society, not a unicultural society? And my answer to that is that multiculturalism is superficial. It's very superficial. Um, being for example, if it's religious diversity, just as an example, you're not really allowed to be religiously diverse. Okay? The the liberal position is that all religious differences are like superficial differences. Everyone goes to heaven. Everyone's like whatever. You can practice whatever you want to practice, whatever behavior you think is okay. Um, so like you're allowed aesthetic differences. You're allowed to eat different food. You're allowed to dress differently, but you're not actually allowed to represent your culture and identity in a meaningful way. It's the Muslim community in any Western country has never been genuinely represented. The only representation allowed is like the trans hijabi, and that's it, right? And it's the same thing with Christianity. The only Christianity that's really tolerated is like the liberal progressive Christianity. You're never going to get a TLM Catholic tradcath who's in politics. It's never going to happen. So yeah, this centralization is cringe, and that centralization comes at the cost of like local power, which is like the closest you can meaningfully get to liberty. Um, and yeah, it's silly. Now, the as like a foreshadowing, the country that I think was one of the first to really start centralizing stuff was England. And I know like Denmark I think was a absolute monarchy quite early, but England was pretty centralized very early on, which allowed them to actually do pretty well in the Hundred Years' War, despite being a significantly smaller country. And that sort of centralization led to the death of local culture. I mean, like, how many people speak Cornish? You know, Cornish literally died, and no one speaks like the Welsh. Their language is on their edge. Same with Gaelic. Same with Scots, and same with local dialects of English. That's something that people forget is like back in the day, your everything was written in the dialect of whatever place it was. So Northumbrian monks would write in Northumbrian English, and it would be different to English written in Wessex. Um, that's how like big the linguistic diversity is or was. But yeah, diversity of opinion and culture is essentially only in a modern state tolerated within a very limited bound of liberalism. And meaningful and actual local or cultural religious diversity is never tolerated because you can't represent a meaningfully different plurality. It breaks down the democratic system. So, what's the takeaway? Power can really only exist when or diversity of power or liberty can only exist when the power is localized, when you actually have power structures that can represent you. That's the closest you can get to diversity or liberty. So I would say if you want more rights, the more you decentralize authority, meaningfully decentralize authority, the more power and ability you'll have to exercise your own freedom. But that's it. That's it for today. I'm Sinner, and I will see you in the next one. Bye.